it has no restriction to have the environment impact assessment done or not in case it's doing a particular project. But that means that the government is now beyond environment protection laws when it comes to pursuing a particular project. That's one problem that we have. But like you said, and like so you mentioned, that it's the developing countries that need to pick up the ball now, as the developed countries have apparently set the issue aside. Now, once we try to do that, second problem that I see, I've been covering the environment for a while. Environment protection laws that we have, they might be very nice and they might be very environment friendly, but the problem arises when implementation and the empowerment of the regulatory bodies is so weak that the maximum they can do, at least in Pakistan, is fine up to 1 million to any industry who can do its worst. So when it comes to legislation, we need to see there, plus the provincial political willingness on our levels.
Well, let me first respond to the observation made earlier. I just want to ask a question. Isn't civil society exercised about these issues? In other words, if the government is trying to or wanting to bypass environmental legislation and environmental protection, aren't the NGOs and I would say even media making a lot of noise on that issue?
I take a more positive view than Naila and Ali may or may not disagree, but sometimes we also become a little harsh on ourselves. So if I look at it, you're right. But part of the response from civil society and from the citizenry has been actually very strong. So right now there is a judicial commission set up on pollution into the river Ravi. And if you think about how that happens, it happens by A, government action that is not considered appropriate, B, citizen action. Ali is sitting here and others are sitting here who take that citizen action, societal action, C, leading to judicial action, D, leading to a commission which actually brings in academics, civil society and others. Now that doesn't necessarily mean everything is good, but that means that there is an education in society.
No, I agree with that.
Which would be much.
No, with your permission, Chair, just to move beyond this issue. What you have highlighted, and I think we should recognize this, the action gap or the absence of political will in instances where it happens. And when I come back from Rio, this is the kind of soul searching that the global community was indulging in. That where is the action? Why the governments are failing? Why the governance structures are not that supportive? And UNEP question, I think, comes down to the environmental governance as well. So that point is well taken. I want to come to the question that you raised earlier. It's a complex issue. It takes hundreds of scientists 5 years to give you an assessment report. Research capacity in developing countries is rather limited. Most countries probably don't have the capacity to downscale GSM models to have a more predictable scenario building for a local level, let alone harnessing humanities knowledge that I was referring to. So the question is, how do think tanks, research institutes, civil society organizations create a synergy in their national and regional settings to collaborate with each other and overcome this capacity gap. And that is imperative, as I would imagine, that for most of such organizations, and I'm very happy Elisa is sitting here from WWF, this capacity, having independent capacity is very, very problematic. So I think the question to all of us is, how do we begin to think together or collectively in transboundary context also? When I say transboundary context, climate change has to be seen more than 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 3 degrees. You have to look at the changes in pattern of monsoon and water supply, early warning systems, cross-boundary river issues, for that matter, even management of our food security systems. So it's a very, very complex arena whereby when we have shared ecosystems, collaborative research between think tanks, civil society organizations, research institutes, and universities become very, very critical.
Patrick, push you on that, on the cross-boundary and the regional aspect. You know, you mentioned the 2 billion, and I must confess, this is the first time I've heard 2 billion, but as soon as you mentioned it, it made me think. There are people in this room who were born when the whole world was 2 billion. Right, and this is a massive challenge for the region. Is the region prepared, or what should the region be doing for it?
Well, I think the first thing we should do in the region, and I'm being very blunt, is to break down the barriers of communication, exchange of ideas, exchange of solutions, and a common understanding of problems. Because, you know, we cannot possibly delay this kind of an initiative much longer. Because I believe that there is so much benefit in cooperation that it outweighs any other benefits that we might get.
Can I push on this?
Yeah, by all means.
Suggest 3 or 4 things that you would want to say to your Prime Minister or our Prime Minister that you think India and Pakistan can and should do tomorrow on climate change.
Well, firstly, I think we need to understand the impacts of climate change, which should be looked at within a South Asian context, where we see which regions are going to be vulnerable to what. And I think that will require scientific cooperation between institutions in the region, because that's the only way you can get a buy-in from each of the countries. I think that's item 1. Item 2 would be that we need to work together to achieve economies of scale in production and use of renewable energy. Item 3 would be perhaps the establishment of common infrastructure. Now, whether it is floods in Pakistan or droughts in another part of the country, I think integrating our approaches to management of water, of course, it's tricky. There are all kinds of political minefields over there. But any rational assessment will tell you that if we can plan for our water resources jointly in a way that sort of ensures security for everybody in the region, that's the way to go. So, you know, I think there are several examples of this nature which really are win-win opportunities.
I'm particularly glad that you mentioned renewable, where a lot of work is being done in the region, particularly in India. Technology is already being adapted to the conditions of the region that can. I'm being a glutton here, but I'll throw one more question before I go to Ali Habib on this. Your best assessment, is climate change and the common challenge of climate change more likely to bring the region together or tear it more apart?
I would think it will be the former, because once we realize that we are in it together, there might be a much stronger level of support for working together. In fact, even 20 years ago, when the delegations from the South Asian countries were going to Rio for Rio 1992, there was a request from the Pakistan government and the Sri Lankan government to carry out an interactive exercise with Delhi. Because as it happens, we were about the only institution in South Asia at that time that was working on some of the policy aspects of climate change. So we actually held a workshop in New Delhi where all the delegations of South Asia came before going to Rio. So I think that was an indication of the perception that this is a common concern. Let's keep aside our differences and let's work together in understanding what this common problem is.
I want to come to indigenous knowledge and to communities in a minute, but your example made me realize back in 1990, I think it was the first India-Pakistan Environmental Summit. Unfortunately, I think it was the only one, so never call the meeting first until you know you have a second. But the late Anil Agarwal helped write the final declaration, and one of the things there was about this fence that was going to be built on the border. And the words he used was that even if we need to keep the people from going across, let's at least let the birds fly from one side to the other. Ali, you had a question, and then we'll come to local knowledge.
I was just wondering that I think the IPCC by design is supposed to advise the government. So now hearing from this discussion, that aspect is clearly not producing the results. So in some ways, it's good that that realization has set in and we are not fooling ourselves. So the question here is, can there be an opportunity that the same guidance be provided instead of governments to civil society organizations? And for one thing I can think of which is practical is a set of indicators which can act as a mirror, can be selected on the basis of ecosystems or regions, and maybe looking at forest cover assessment or the mangrove forest, or even simpler things like arrival of migratory birds, time of year, you mentioned rhododendron. And I think there is a lot of appetite in Pakistan as well as other solutions, that they would love to participate in something like that and just contribute directly to the solution which they will benefit from. So let's say bypass the government, but staying within the mandate that the government has stated and announced only in terms of red.
Dr. Pachauri, can I take one more?
It's actually related. My name is Benjamin and I'm a researcher. If we look at the water cycles that govern our lifeline business, really if you look at it, we are going to the Tibetan region, which is the master copy of what happens here. But to penetrate even at the smallest level, collaborative research, to go into Kashmir and Tibet are the closest guarded secrets of the governments of India and China. And when I think back to work, for example, that UNICEF did in the 80s on polio vaccination in war zones, there's a metaphor where in the worst, in Congo and Afghanistan, they created corridors in which this particular service delivery was made possible by all warring parties. And there seems to be an opportunity that perhaps the IPCC can take up to create small examples of corridors in what is politically a very fractious region. So building on your optimism, maybe there should be practical models that we all together put into place would be worth thinking about.
Yeah, let me respond to, Adil is a stalwart of the IPCC process, and he would tell you that the IPCC is really a very fragile organization as far as the core organization is concerned. For 17 years, you would be surprised at the size of the IPCC secretariat. And I'd like anybody to take a guess, how many people do you think in the first 17 years of its existence IPCC employed? Can anyone take a guess? There were 5 people. But now we have about a dozen. And therefore we are really not able to carry out any outreach effort whatsoever. With a lot of difficulty, we now have a senior communications officer and one junior person as well. But governments have just not appreciated the importance of the IPCC spreading its message. So we are really not providing advice to anyone. And in any case, we are not supposed to be policy prescriptive in our advice. We are supposed to be policy relevant. So we lay out the choices, and it is for anyone to pick which particular choice the government wants to take.
But can you push on, because Ali Fakir has the same issue. Is it really, is IPCC, is it the best place to do the public communication? Scientists don't have that skill, shouldn't have that skill. Actually, you should be very wary of a scientist who is very savvy with the media. Because the public communication is about cutting things to making them simpler than they are, making them fancier than they are. isn't that the role of Ali and all the other Alis?
Can I give a short answer, provided we agree that the last sentence from this panel that we have to run? I think, sir, with all humility, I think this is the art of it. Scientists are not already best communicators. And their job is not really to make that simple pictorial book from the house lady that I mentioned and my time that I mentioned. That is having a relatively unreasonable expectation. It would be very good if they can give us good science. But then we leave to some other groups to take up from there. And in that pursuit, let me run a commercial and then I'll go. One of the organizations that I'm working with, we approached IPCC's secretariat and they have recently produced a special report on extreme events called Aspects Report. A 700-page report that looked at the global trend on extreme events, freak events or climate events, whichever term you wish to use, and see if there is indeed any perceptible trend and that policymakers should. The policymaker may not be too much concerned about 2 degrees temperature, but very concerned about floods. So I go to my Prime Minister, readily look at the extreme event. So we requested them, can we have an abstract of that report without going through your refereed process, put some graphs in, hopefully very accurately, and have a small report of 10-20 pages that a policymaker could have quickly read. They graciously agreed. And that report is a very good report. It's on our website. Kindly visit this. And if you happen to be in Islamabad tomorrow morning, 9:30 or 3 now.
With the advertisement, but before you run, I have a one line last question for Dr. Pachauri. Looking forward, future positive for climate change in the world, for climate change in South Asia, or not?
No, I'm positive, I'm very optimistic, and frankly, if I wasn't optimistic, I would have given up ages ago. And I've taken and received a lot of attacks, and I've been accused of making millions of dollars and wearing $1,000 suits. My suit is actually made by a tailor called Chadda, and he came from, the what should I say? Chadda doesn't make chaddis, so anyway, this guy came on national television and in India, and he was asked about what link does he have with Pachauri's clothing, and he said, look, I normally charge 2,500 rupees for a suit. You've beaten me down to 2,200. And for the last 10 years, I've been stitching all your clothes. So the point I'm making is, as President Truman said, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And I think the very fact that there's so much criticism, so much attack on the IPCC means that we must be doing something right.
You must be doing something right. Thank you very much. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. That's a very apt comment also for climate change.
I know you're going to find my boss, Rizwan. He just announced 5-7 more minutes.
Very nice. Thank you, Rizwan. We are very glad. But as you were saying, if you can't get the heat in the kitchen is a very good metaphor for climate change too. Those of us in South Asia are used to the heat, but the heat keeps going up, and there is no other kitchen to go to. So on the second part, is the future positive for South Asia? And I wanted to link that to the point that's been raised actually by a number of people. Does that mean that we have to move from global research, global action, to local research, and local action, and local communities?
Well, I think we necessarily have to do that, particularly in respect of adapting to the impacts of climate change. Because unless we create local capacity, which has to be based on local understanding of what we're going to face, we are going to be extremely vulnerable. This region is very, very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And therefore, this is something that we have to take in hand urgently and start building capacity. Simple things. In 2003, there was a heat wave in Europe which killed over 40,000 people. There was almost a similar intensity heat wave in 2006, but there were very few deaths, thankfully, because they were prepared. You take the case of Cyclone Douglas in Myanmar in 2008. A few months apart, there was a similar intensity cyclone in Bangladesh. Now, Myanmar saw over 150,000 deaths. Bangladesh, very few, thank God, because they were ready. In 2003, there was a heat wave in Andhra Pradesh, and the Chief Minister asked me to chair a committee to go into this. And I was appalled to find that there was no early warning, and that simple things like oral rehydration therapy were not known to people. So I'm mentioning all this because we need to put in place a system, we need to create capacity by which we can deal with the impacts of climate change in this region. I mean, happily, we are a people who are extremely resilient. We've seen that in Pakistan after the
But you can only push people's resilience till that much before they break.
Exactly. And this is something we brought out very clearly in the SREX report that we could reach tipping points in social and ecosystems which would make it extremely challenging for human society to be able to deal with some of the extreme events and disasters that we're going to face.
Am I right in hearing you, and I know Ali has something to say too, but am I right in hearing you and interpreting it as the challenge for the future is no longer the challenge of science alone, it is the challenge of action, which means it's a much more difficult challenge. You know, science can give you a 1,000-page report. Action actually requires a much more difficult enterprise.
Absolutely, but it has to be action driven by scientific knowledge. Now, one of the reasons why I think the UN FCCC process, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is in serious trouble is because they don't discuss the science at all. They are only bogged down by narrow and short-term political issues. And I don't want to say this since you assured me there's no media and that you're going to give me the original of the recording that you're going to make so that I can walk away with it in my pocket. I think the UN FCCC process is breaking down. I'm not too sure whether it's going to get anywhere, but that's an opinion.
There is media, and if you want to stop, then we should do so now.
I just want to make a related but for a different point. We need to understand, people sitting in this room, there's no going back. It's a long haul. It's going to run through this century. Many of us may not be around. And I've seen the span of last 2 decades, from total denial that nothing has happened, to being fatalistic that everything can be attributed like floods to climate change. Between these two extremes, there's a lot that can be done, that is being done, and that should be done. And I think being alarmist to draw attention of policymaker or scientific community will not be a great help. I think we need to understand that just like resilience, we have to be very tenacious, very patient with this process. And it's an irreversible process that we have already unleashed in the last 150 years or so. So we need to be a lot more measured in our comments. Saying that the biggest flood on 1920-11 or something was climate change, I think it's a loose story. I think when they say Bangladesh is ground zero, I think it's a true story. We need to be sitting in an academic institution, and when we think of partnerships between think tanks and universities and civil society organizations, I think we need to be a lot more cautious. Now, second question is about the action that you, of course, even if there was no climate change, our issues are very stubborn. The poverty has been there, and it has been expanding. We have been diminishing our natural resource base, and a large segment, percentage of our population has been living in fragile areas, in marginalized lands and marginalized livelihoods and so on and so forth. Climate change is only a multiplier for us, at least for this generation. And that we need to understand fully, that even when the policymaker begins to understand, and I think there's a better understanding now than a few years ago, complexities of climate change, we should not allow them to whitewash or greenwash the existing practices by calling it green economy, or by calling it green agenda, or by calling it climate compatible development or climate smart development. There may be a lot of malpractice or maladaptation happening. So I am not against co-benefits at all, but sometimes I feel that the policymaker needs to be cautioned that it's a far more serious matter, and empty words and rhetoric and changing vocabulary will not be a great service to the people of this nation.
Let me before I end and thank you, ask that one other, since the last question wasn't the last question, we'll make this one the last question. What do you say to the guy who's probably sitting in this room but has been too polite to put it to you like that? That, thank you Mr. Pachauri, thank you IPCC, all of this is real, all of this is important, but I have too many other much more pressing, much more urgent issues, from who the Prime Minister is going to be tomorrow, to whether I'll have electricity this night or not. And why should I be thinking climate change and not about this?
Well, my answer would be in two parts. Firstly, whatever you're suffering from will get worse with the impacts of climate change. So you better do something about it. And secondly, if you don't have electricity in your home, then please look at solutions which will give you that electricity, and some of them are based on renewable energy technologies, where you have control over them. You're not relying on a centralized supply system which is faltering and failing anyway. So I think these are win-win opportunities and they are in your interest. So if you have something to complain about, believe me my friend, you're going to be complaining about a lot more if you don't do something about this.
Thank you. On that note of realism, on that note actually of optimism, let me thank Dr. Pachauri once again for coming to LUMS, Ali Fakir Sheikh for bringing you to LUMS, all of you for being here. I think it's been a great, great conversation. Thank you very much. Please do join us for a cup of tea at the executive dining hall. People can share.